February 19th, 1945. Aero 900 hours. Green Beach, Iwo Jima. Corporal Tony Stein sprinted across the black volcanic sand, his custom Stinger machine gun blazing at 2,500 rounds per minute. Japanese bullets whined past his head as he charged toward a concrete pillbox that had his platoon pinned down on the beach. The 23-year-old toolmaker from Dayton, Ohio, had built this weapon himself, salvaging an aircraft machine gun from a crashed Navy fighter and modifying it with parts from an M1 Garand rifle and a Browning automatic rifle. No Marine had ever carried anything like it into battle. As Stein reached the pillbox, he unleashed a devastating burst that silenced the Japanese machine gun crew inside. 20 enemy soldiers would die under his fire that day, but that was just the beginning of the most extraordinary individual assault in Marine Corps history. 8 times he would run back to the beach for ammunition. 8 times he would return carrying a wounded Marine to safety. And when his Stinger was shot from his hands twice by enemy fire, he simply picked it up and kept fighting. What happened on that hellish volcanic island would prove that sometimes one man with the right weapon and absolute determination could change the course of an entire battle, even against impossible odds. Anthony Michael Stein was born on September 30th, 1921, in Dayton, Ohio, to Steve and Rose Stein, Jewish immigrants from Austria-Hungary. His father died when Tony was 3, leaving his mother to raise 8 children during the Great Depression. Growing up fatherless in a working-class neighborhood, Stein learned to fight for everything. He became an accomplished amateur boxer, competing in Golden Gloves tournaments where his speed and power made him locally famous. As a toolmaker at Patterson Field and later at Delco Products Division of General Motors, Stein learned precision machining and mechanical problem-solving, skills that would prove crucial in combat. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Stein immediately knew his duty. For the son of Austrian Jewish immigrants, military service meant proving his family's loyalty to America. On September 22, 1942, he enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserve, choosing Marines because they're the first sent into battle. After boot camp, Stein was selected for the elite Paramarines, the Marine Corps' experimental paratrooper unit. Though they never actually parachuted into combat, the Paramarines received specialized training that made them some of the toughest fighters in the Pacific. Stein fought in the Vella La Vella and Bougainville campaigns, where he killed 5 Japanese snipers in a single day, demonstrating the deadly marksmanship that would make him legendary. But Stein's most important contribution to the war effort was still to come. His background as a toolmaker and his intimate knowledge of weapon systems were about to converge in a way that would change the nature of infantry firepower. In 1944, the Paramarines were disbanded as the Marine Corps reorganized for the massive amphibious assaults that would be necessary to defeat Japan. Stein was transferred to Company A, 1st Battalion, 28th Marines, 5th Marine Division, a newly formed unit that would spearhead one of the war's most brutal battles. During the long voyage across the Pacific toward their next target, Stein spent his time working on a project that would define his legacy. Using skills learned in Dayton's machine shops, he began modifying a weapon that would give his unit a devastating advantage in the close-quarters combat they would face. The weapon that became known as the Stinger started as an AN-M2 aircraft machine gun salvaged from a crashed Navy fighter plane. This was a modified version of the standard M1919 Browning machine gun, designed specifically for aircraft use. The aircraft version was significantly lighter than the standard infantry M1919, 21.5 pounds compared to 31 pounds, and had a much higher rate of fire. Where the M1919 fired 400-600 rounds per minute, the AN-M2 could unleash 1,200-1,500 rounds per minute, designed for the split-second engagements of aerial combat. But aircraft machine guns were never designed for infantry use. They had spade grips instead of a stock, no bipod for ground support, and no sight suitable for aimed fire at ground targets. Most Marines would have seen it as useful only for spare parts. Tony Stein saw it as the foundation for the perfect infantry weapon. Working with fellow Marine Sergeant Mel Grevich and Private First Class John Little, Stein began a complete transformation of the aircraft gun. They fitted it with a buttstock cut from an M1 Garand rifle, giving the weapon the familiar feel of a standard infantry rifle. A rear sight from a Browning automatic rifle was welded to the receiver, providing precision aiming capability for ground targets. A bar bipod was attached to the barrel, allowing the weapon to be fired accurately from a prone position. Most importantly, they replaced the aircraft's spade grips with a fabricated trigger mechanism that allowed the weapon to be fired like a conventional rifle. The result was a machine gun that could be operated by a single Marine but delivered the devastating firepower of a crew-served weapon. The Marines called it the Stinger because of its incredibly high rate of fire. When Stein pulled the trigger, the sound was distinctive enough to be heard above the roar of battle. In the hands of a skilled operator, it could deliver more rounds on target in 30 seconds than a standard bar could fire in 5 minutes. 6 Stingers were completed before the 5th Marine Division sailed for its next target. 4 were distributed among Company G's rifle platoons. 1 went to the demolition section, Sergeant Grevich kept one for himself, and the 6th was given to Tony Stein. As the convoy of ships approached their destination in February 1945, few Marines knew they were sailing toward the most heavily fortified position in the Pacific. Their target was a sulfur mining island 8 miles square and honeycombed with 11 miles of underground tunnels. The island was called Iwo Jima, and it would test every weapon, tactic, and ounce of courage the Marines possessed. Iwo Jima was unlike any battlefield the Marines had encountered in the Pacific. The Japanese had spent 8 months turning the volcanic island into an underground fortress, with interconnected tunnels, hidden artillery positions, and concrete pillboxes that could withstand direct hits from naval gunfire. The island's strategic importance was undeniable. Its airfields could serve as a base for fighter escorts protecting B-29 bombers attacking Japan, and as an emergency landing strip for damaged aircraft returning from missions over the Japanese mainland. But the Japanese understood Iwo Jima's importance as well. Under the command of General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, 22,000 Japanese defenders had prepared to fight to the death. They had no intention of banzai charges or glorious last stands. Instead, they would use the island's terrain and their carefully prepared positions to inflict maximum casualties on the invading Americans. On the morning of February 19, 1945, Tony Stein loaded his Stinger with a 100-round belt of .30-06 ammunition and prepared to hit the beach in the first wave of the assault. He had stripped off his helmet and boots to improve his mobility, a decision that would prove crucial in the hours ahead. As the landing craft approached Green Beach at the base of Mount Suribachi, the Marines were puzzled by the lack of Japanese resistance. There was no artillery fire, no machine gun fire, nothing but an ominous silence that made veteran Marines nervous. The deception lasted exactly long enough for the first waves to get ashore and begin moving inland. Then the Japanese defenders opened fire with a coordinated barrage that turned the beaches into a killing ground. Artillery shells and mortar rounds began falling among the Marines with deadly accuracy. Machine gun fire from hidden pillboxes swept the open ground between the beach and the first ridgeline. Marines who had survived Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan said they had never seen anything like the volume of fire pouring down on Iwo Jima's beaches. This was the moment Tony Stein had prepared for. While other Marines sought cover behind sand dunes and scattered equipment, Stein moved forward with his Stinger looking for targets. He was the first man from his unit to establish a firing position away from the beach. Setting up his Stinger on its bipod, Stein began laying down covering fire for his platoon as they tried to advance inland. But the Japanese defenses were too strong, and his comrades were pinned down by concentrated machine gun and mortar fire. Marines were falling wounded in the open ground between the beach and the enemy positions, but no one could reach them without drawing deadly fire. That's when Tony Stein made a decision that would define his place in Marine Corps legend. Standing upright in full view of the enemy, Stein began waving his arms and shouting to draw the Japanese fire toward himself. It was an act of incredible courage, or incredible insanity, but it served its purpose. As enemy machine gunners focused their fire on the standing Marine, Stein was able to pinpoint the exact locations of their hidden positions. With the enemy positions identified, Stein shouldered his Stinger and began the most extraordinary individual assault in the history of the Battle of Iwo Jima. One by one, he charged the Japanese pillboxes. The Stinger's devastating rate of fire allowed him to suppress enemy positions with short, accurate bursts while he closed the distance. When he reached each position, he would pour fire through the gun slits until all resistance ceased. 20 Japanese soldiers died under Stein's fire during this single-handed assault. Pillbox after pillbox fell to his methodical attack, each one silenced by the distinctive roar of the Stinger's incredible rate of fire. But the weapon's devastating firepower came with a price. It consumed ammunition at an incredible rate. A 100-round belt that might last a standard machine gunner for several minutes was exhausted in seconds when the Stinger was firing at maximum rate. This created a new problem. Stein was running out of ammunition far from any resupply point, surrounded by enemy positions, with wounded Marines scattered across the battlefield who needed immediate evacuation. Stein's solution was characteristically direct and incredibly brave. Kicking off his boots and tossing aside his helmet to improve his speed, Stein began making solo runs back to the beach to retrieve ammunition. But he refused to make the trips empty-handed. Each time he returned to the rear, he carried a wounded Marine who needed medical attention. 8 times during that first day on Iwo Jima, Tony Stein made the dangerous journey across open ground swept by enemy fire. 8 times he returned with fresh ammunition and the satisfaction of knowing he had saved another Marine's life. During these resupply runs, his Stinger was shot from his hands twice by Japanese marksmen. Each time, Stein simply picked up the weapon, checked it for damage, and continued fighting. The psychological effect of Stein's assault was enormous. Japanese defenders who had planned to hold their positions indefinitely found themselves under attack by what seemed like a one-man army. The sound of the Stinger's rapid fire became a source of terror for enemy troops and inspiration for advancing Marines. By the end of February 19th, Stein and his Stinger had broken the deadlock on Green Beach. His destruction of key enemy positions allowed his unit to advance inland and establish defensive positions for the night. But Stein's war was far from over. The 28th Marines spent the next several days fighting their way up the slopes of Mount Suribachi, the volcanic peak that dominated the southern end of Iwo Jima. The fighting was brutal, with every cave and tunnel having to be cleared by flamethrowers and explosives. On February 23rd, a patrol from the 28th Marines reached the summit of Mount Suribachi and raised an American flag in one of the most famous photographs of World War II. Tony Stein was part of the unit that made that iconic moment possible, but during the fighting for Suribachi, Stein was wounded by shrapnel and evacuated to a hospital ship offshore. For most Marines, this would have been a blessing, a chance to recover from wounds while the rest of the unit continued the deadly advance up the island. Tony Stein saw it differently. When word reached the hospital ship that the 28th Marines were taking heavy casualties during the assault on Hill 362A, Stein left his hospital bed and returned to his unit. Despite his wounds and against direct orders, he was determined to rejoin his men in their hour of greatest need. On March 1, 1945, Corporal Tony Stein was leading a 19-man patrol to reconnoiter a Japanese machine gun emplacement that had Company A pinned down. It was exactly the kind of dangerous, close-quarters mission that had made him famous throughout the 5th Marine Division. As the patrol moved carefully through broken ground toward the enemy position, a Japanese sniper took careful aim and fired a single shot. Tony Stein, the toolmaker from Dayton who had become one of the Marine Corps' greatest warriors, was killed instantly. He was 10 days short of his 24th birthday. Tony Stein's Medal of Honor was presented to his widow, Joan, on February 19, 1946, exactly 1 year after his heroic assault on Green Beach. The ceremony was held in the office of Ohio Governor Frank Lausch with full military honors. The citation specifically mentioned his personally improvised aircraft-type weapon, making the Stinger one of the few non-standard weapons ever referenced in a Medal of Honor citation. Stein's nomination received 15 endorsements, the most of any Marine in the Pacific Theater. Initially buried in the 5th Division Cemetery on Iwo Jima, Stein's remains were returned to the United States in 1948. He was reinterred in Calvary Cemetery in Dayton following funeral services at Our Lady of the Rosary Church. The 6 Stinger machine guns that had performed so effectively on Iwo Jima were presumably destroyed after the war, as the military typically disposed of non-standard equipment. None survive today, though several functioning replicas have been built by military historians and weapons enthusiasts. USS Stein, a Knox-class frigate, was commissioned in 1972 and named in Tony Stein's honor. The ship served with distinction until 1992, carrying on the legacy of the Marine who had refused to quit when everything seemed hopeless. Tony Stein's story embodies the Marine Corps values of improvisation, determination, and putting the mission above personal safety. His custom Stinger proved that innovation and ingenuity could be just as important as courage and training in winning battles. But perhaps most importantly, Stein's 8 trips to rescue wounded Marines while under fire demonstrated the Marine Corps principle that no one is left behind. In a Corps that values brotherhood above all else, Tony Stein stands as the ultimate example of a Marine who would rather die than abandon his comrades. The toolmaker from Dayton had proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon in war is the refusal to give up when facing impossible odds. On February 19, 1945, one Marine with a custom machine gun changed the course of the Battle of Iwo Jima. His legacy lives on in every Marine who learns that innovation, courage, and loyalty to your brothers can overcome any enemy, no matter how well prepared or numerous they might be. The Stinger fell silent when Tony Stein died, but the spirit that created it, the Marine ability to improvise, adapt, and overcome, continues to inspire warriors to this day.